I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar. The Curlew Action team have brought together 3 very interesting speakers. We shall start with Katrine Eldegard, who has reviewed safety procedures for catching and tagging birds in Norway. It's a reminder that every time we handle a curlew, we potentially add to its stress levels, and we need to minimize any problems that it may encounter. In the other 2 talks, Rachel Taylor and Verena Rupprecht are going to be revealing information gathered from curlew tracking studies in Wales and Germany, which will have relevance to people studying curlew across Europe. So at the end of each talk, I may ask a couple of questions, but the main Q&A will take place once all 3 speakers have finished. So as Megan said, please put your questions in the chat box, and if you could, as she said, indicate who you're asking the question of, then when we get to the Q&A section, it'll be a lot easier for the 2 of us to organise what's going on. Because behind the scenes, Megan will be picking up some of the common themes to help me steer our discussions. So we're going to start with Katrine Eldegard. She joins us from the Norwegian University of Life Sciences. Katrine is particularly interested in how human activities and the way we use the land impacts upon natural ecosystems and species. Particularly, she's working on power infrastructures and forests. Professor Eldegard recently led a major project looking at the effects of marking and tracking methods on bird welfare. The report outlines best practices and ways to reduce harm when using various methods and devices. The fact is that many bird species are in decline, often due to human activity and environmental change. To protect them, scientists need details on bird movements, habitat use, migration, breeding, and survival. Tracking technologies help gather this vital information, often from fewer birds than older methods required. Tagging individuals also brings additional benefits. It can help people connect with them. We give them names and we tell their stories. And this recognition of individual birds and learning about their habits makes conservation personal and meaningful for people, and that is important too. This evening's presentation will focus on making catching and tracking birds as safe as possible. Katrine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Graham. So first of all, thank you for inviting me to take part in this webinar, and I really appreciate that. So as you probably know, I've never studied curlews myself, but I do have some other experiences I hope might be relevant for the discussion. And even though I don't work directly with curlews, I see them often in the landscape in southwestern Norway, where I'm currently carrying out other types of field work. So this photo is from that landscape and taken by a collaborator of mine, Roy Mangersnes. So we do have curlews in that landscape, so I thought that was a bit like interesting. When I got the invitation, I was in the middle of this landscape and I just seen the curlew, so the timing was perfect. So I won't repeat everything that is on this slide, but the point is that I have a rather broad academic and scientific interest, and you also mentioned some of my main interests, Graham, and that's right. And then in addition, I've done quite a lot of these risk assessments and evidence synthesis, and that's the reason why I'm here today, because we did this huge report on assessing the risk of harm to welfare of wild birds when we capture them, handle them, mark them, and track them. So I started out studying birds myself a long time ago. So this is a 30-year-old photo almost from my PhD studies on I did my PhD on behavioral ecology and studied parental care of in owls and diurnal raptors. So this is a juvenile boreal owl, which is fitted with a radio tag. You can see the antenna there. So this was a long time ago, and then I had a long break from owl research. But so I'm sort of back to not exactly where I started. I've stepped up a bit, so now it's eagle owls. It's one of the the species that I study. So I'm a project leader for a large project where we look at the influence of onshore wind energy development on eagle owls and bats. So we radio tag both eagle owls. This one is fitted with a satellite transmitter, and we also radio tag bats with glue on transmitters. So as I said, we have been involved in this large risk assessment where we looked at effects of capture, handling, sampling, marking, and tracking on the welfare of wild birds. This is because I'm part of a scientific panel that do carry out risk assessments on assignment from the Norwegian Animal Welfare Authority and also the Norwegian Environment Agency. That's the two licensing authorities in Norway if you want to capture and mark and track birds. So we were going to look at both direct and immediate welfare effects and also long-term effects. So, and this project team, although I led it, I had help from many other good researchers. So it was a combined effort by ornithologists or bird researchers and veterinarians. And then we had international reviewers, including from the UK with Gary Curlew, who was a referee on this report. So just a quick note on the scope of the assessment. So it's supposed to be used for the Norwegian licensing authorities, but we included it covers most bird orders, because every bird order that is represented on Norwegian mainland or territorial waters or overseas, like in the Antarctica region, was also included. So it's actually just a few purely tropical bird orders that are not included in this report. So it's a large, it was quite a large task. So within the animal welfare literature and research, there's a strong focus on the so-called 3R approach. The 3 R's being replace, reduce, refine as the guiding principles to minimize animal use, or like the number of animals used, and also to improve welfare. But when we entered into this work, we decided on focusing on refinement of methods when a researcher has already decided that tagging is the most appropriate approach. And we also focused on new tagging and tracking devices that provide detailed movement data from a reduced number of tagged birds. So we did not go into whether you should replace field studies of wild birds with alternative approaches. We sort of started from where a researcher has decided that marking an individual is the way to go. And then what can we do to improve animal welfare from there? So we started out with trying to agree on what animal welfare is. And that's actually not trivial, because of the literature on animal welfare is dominated by literature on research on domesticated animals. But we ended up with using a definition that is much used in the animal welfare literature. That the welfare of an individual is its state as regards to its attempt to cope with its environment. That's quite a mouthful, but anyway, that's sort of what we used as a definition of what we mean by welfare. And then we tried to find a theoretical or like scientific framework to base our assessments on, because it's very easy to be very subjective. And then we found a publication that we found was quite useful, but it's not made for wild animals or wild birds. So it's feral horses, actually, was in New Zealand. But anyway, this was digged up by the veterinarians, and they did a good and big job with adopting it to assessing wild birds, and I will come back to how we did it on the next slide. But we used this to both guide the literature search and also to make a very systematic framework for doing the assessments. So this is the so-called 5 domains model. So what you do is that you look at both impacts on the animal's ability to get enough food and water and keep its energy balance up. And then you also look at its interaction with the environment, that it doesn't get too cold or overheated or exposed to sunlight too much and things like that. And then it's, of course, direct injuries and health effects, which is the 3rd domain. And then it's all kinds of behavioral interactions. And a lot of it falls into that category, whether it influences predation risk, and migration patterns, behavior in general, things like that. And all these things interact, of course, but these 4 sums up to sort of the total impact of what they call the mental state. And you can, so that's things that, this is super difficult, of course, to assess, and we discussed this at length, but this is the sort of how, yeah, that's this total of the 3-4 domains influence the overall mental state and welfare of the animals. But there's a lot to discuss on this, and it wasn't an easy task at all, but we made a very elaborate big score sheet that we used for every bird group, or every method on every bird group, to do it as systematically and objectively as we possibly could. So I will not go into the details about the literature search, article screening, data extraction, but it was a very extensive task, and it took us quite a long time to get through everything. And we have a large database which came out of it. And then we come to the risk assessment part. So for this risk assessment methodology is quite common in risk assessments in general. So we use a so-called semi-quantitative approach, where the risk of harm to an animal is calculated by combining the likelihood of an impact, as a likelihood of harm, and then combining it with the potential severity. So if there is an impact, how bad is it? And then you combine these two, and then you get the risk. And in addition to getting a risk score like low, moderate, or high risk, you also have a defined criteria about how certain you are, how confident you are in the assessment. And everything here is based on these big score sheets in the background, which I will not go into now. But as I said, we did it for each method and each bird group. So when it comes to which methods, we divided it into general, a lot of capture methods, handling and sampling methods, and then we distinguished between marking for individual identification without tracking or logging devices. And then the other main type was marking for tracking and logging. And then we soon realized that one thing is sort of the type of device, but it's also the mode of attachment that causes welfare issues. So we split it in two, but we sort of described the methods for the types of tags, and then the main risk assessment about how it impacts the welfare is on the mode of attachment. And one of the main, so I will explain why it's both red, yellow, and green colors sort of all over the place here later. I'll just show you an example. So this is the assessment, this risk assessment for use of leg loop harnesses. And of course, you would not use leg loop harnesses for every bird group, but quite a lot of different bird groups. For quite a lot of bird groups, this method is relevant, including for curlews. And then we looked through the literature and the evidence and saw that, well, as for a lot of the other methods, the risk depends on the type of bird to a large extent. So there has been quite a lot of not good incidents and injuries and uncertain, not uncertain, but unfortunate events with, for example, large woodpeckers pecking at the devices and pecking at the harnesses, and that causing problems. And then for other groups, it's not, there has not been many problems. So it depends very much on the bird group. Of course, there can be occasional incidents in every group, but if you look at the large data set and how often you get the problem, some methods for some bird groups come out as low risk of harm. Some are moderate and some are high. So it's a bit all over the place. And therefore, the main conclusion is that this varies, and you have to look at each particular method, and you have to look at each particular bird group when you're going to do these kinds of studies. And then for each method, we have a quite detailed description of best practice for how to use it. And then we also have a quite lengthy, this is just the start at the bottom of the page here, quite a detailed description of risk reducing measures for each method, where you can find useful information. So as I said, risk of negative effects on animal welfare varies greatly between methods, between bird groups, and that's just the way it is. But therefore, it's very important to read up and talk to colleagues and gather as much information and prepare as well as you can before you start using a method. So we also have a general chapter about risk-reducing measures, and I haven't listed all of them here, but I have emphasized the ones that I feel are more important. So, of course, follow best practices, guidelines, read up, talk to colleagues who have used the method before. Super important, being well prepared. And then I cannot emphasize enough training. It's so important. I mean, any method can go wrong if you don't know what you're doing. So just having proper training and having a friendly, experienced person teaching younger people and hands-on experience. This is not something you can just learn from, although I said read up, but you have to train and do it under supervisions many times before you start doing it yourself. So I think that's the most important things we can do to reduce the risk of harm to animal welfare. And then, of course, make sure that you do the maths and find out how much data you really need. It's also about just collect data that is not enough data. So you really have to think about how much data is enough to really answer the questions you have. So having clear questions so that you can actually do pilot and effect studies is also important, in my opinion. So it is difficult to find the right balance, and many species are threatened and have declining populations, and that would sort of, maybe that will, then you would think that then we shouldn't mark them or tag them with these devices, because that could also put them at risk. But I think it's very important to understand that we humans, we alter the environment so much and the habitats of the birds so much. And if we are going to both provide the evidence, often it's things that we sort of know is going on, but it's demanded that you can provide the proof for anyone to take to do something about it. But and this is just a tiny example from this one small area in the region where I do other types of field work, where we see that, especially in the agricultural landscape, that is the black dots here, the decline, probably due to intensification of agriculture, is very marked for curlews, and there seem to be a decline sort of all over the place, and we think it's very related to changes in the habitat, and at least in Norway. And of course, getting more information about habitat use, spatial movements, these things, migration routes, migration patterns, is very important to have some conservation actions that will actually work. So, but it's difficult, and you have to balance this and think carefully about what you do. But I think just having no, we shall not mark birds anymore because it's not good for them. At least that's not where I stand. But I also am very concerned about animal welfare, and I want us to everyone to be very do our very best to prevent harmful incidents to the birds. And then the final point that Graham also mentioned is that I actually think that it will help to reach out to the general public if they got to know individuals. We've seen some spectacular examples in Norway where they have marked, for example, ospreyed and put it on the equivalent to BBC, like a 24/7 camera, so people can go in and follow the osprey nest from the spring and until the fledglings leave the nest, and that creates a lot of engagement and good attention. Okay, so thank you very much. I think that's it for now.
Katrine, thank you very much. That last slide, it looks so much like the situation in Iceland, where the potentially because agricultural practices are happening earlier in the season, there's more of an interaction with waders, not curlew in Iceland, but of it. Anyway, that's not your forte. And that was a really useful reminder of our responsibilities as researchers. We need to operate as safely as we can, and also to make full use of tracking data. And as you said, we need to operate efficiently. So one of the ways to do this is to make sure that tracking data are archived and registered with Global Wader. That way, individual birds can help to answer several research questions. There's more about that in a Wadetail's blog called Making Full Use of Tracking Data, which I wrote on behalf of the Global Wader partnership. I've got a couple of questions for you, Katrina, and then we'll pull up other questions later. I see that sort of waders ended up in one small green box in the bottom left corner, which is very nice because it means that the impact is small when we do studies. Did you find much variation between the ways that different species from the same families react to being handled or behave when wearing tracking devices? Because obviously you're lumping things together. How much variation was there within families?
Just on a general note, I can say that it's quite a lot. That also, it's sort of partly reflected in the confidence, but also in the text with all the references. So we sort of describe it more in words. You have to look a bit in the text if you want to find your particular species. But yes, there is definitely some variation, and that could have to do with so many things. For example, if you have, let's say, owls, depending on whether they nest in a cavity or not, it can influence the situation quite a lot. For example, one thing about waders is that this is one of the groups that is quite vulnerable to what we call capture myopathy, so that it's sort of this holding the legs, and their legs are vulnerable. So the capturing of waders is often that's a thing that you have to be more careful, think more about compared to some other species. They're not so robust to that. And then there are other methods, and all these leg flag things is also depends quite a lot on the species. So it's very the report was already super long, so we had to sort of do some kind of generalizations, but we have all the information that we could come across is accessible in the report. So if there is information on individual species, what you could do is to just do the PDF, look at the PDF and search for the species name, and then all the information that we found will come up. But yes, there is variation even within a family. And then, for example, glue-on methods. If it's a bird species, often you think that glue-on method is very like benign and not a problem. But if it's a passerine that is running around in the vegetation on the ground a lot, things can get stuck in the glue before it hardens, and they can get entangled, for example. So it depends very much on the ecology of the species, and you have to think carefully about how it moves around in its environment and how it can these devices can interact with the environment too.
Thank you very much. I shan't ask a second question. That was, you basically gave two answers there, which was really kind of you. So two things just to point out. Firstly, there was a request that your report was linked to, and I see that has been done. So thank you very much for that. So I think this report will be very useful to quite a lot of people who are watching this, both people who just want to operate carefully and some people who are actually dealing with the licensing of this sort of thing. So thank you, Norway. You have helped us a lot. So we very much appreciated.
I also want to add that I forgot to include the reference to the last figure, so I will put that in the chat myself in case someone. I think I should give credit to the ones that, as a minimum, to those who made the graph. But yes, thank you for the interest in the report, and it's been the back. Just a bit of context. So there's been it has been super difficult and increasingly difficult to get the license to tag birds in Norway over time. So, and there's been a bit of a tension, I think I can say that, between often the Environment Agency will say yes, because you need the permit from both agencies, and then the Animal Welfare Authority were more strict and maybe said no, and there was no system for them talking to each other. So there was a bit of a frustration among researchers, I think, about this getting stricter and stricter, and it's good that it's strict, but it was also maybe preventing some important studies, and we'll see now that the report is out, maybe it gets a bit easier. I don't know.
Yep. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much indeed, Katrine. That was exceptionally useful, and I think it sets us up nicely for the rest of the evening. So the second person talking to us today is Rachel Taylor. She heads up the BTO's team in Wales, and she's been involved in Welsh curlew research for over a decade. Rachel is a keen waderologist, but her interests are broad, and the glass art that she produces is absolutely stunning. There you are, plug for you, Rachel. In her talk this evening, Rachel will focus on why we tag birds, and curlew in particular. She'll explain how tracking is providing insights into the lives of Welsh curlews, setting her talk within a broader tracking landscape. The title of her presentation is Perspectives on Tracking Curlew. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Graham. As Graham says, I've been involved in tracking curlew since 2015, actually. Up until 2015, we really weren't tracking curlew, and I was involved in a winter tracking project, wintering birds in South Wales, at a time when I was starting to really worry about curlew, particularly because at that time we'd had 40 years of agri-environment schemes that were intended to improve the prospects of the species, the conservation of the species across Wales, and curlew had been notably not responding to them. And I was starting to worry that there was something critical that we didn't know about curlew, particularly in Welsh landscapes, but actually in any landscape. And that started me thinking about the power, the potential power of tracking to answer some of those questions. But as you've already seen, it's not a simple decision to make, either to catch a wild bird or to tag it. And I'd like to spend the first half of my talk introducing you to what goes on in a waderologist's head when we start to try and make this decision, when we're deciding whether the risks and benefits balance each other. And then to follow up with a bit more information about the sorts of things that we're finding now as a result of making those decisions again and again. And every time we make this decision, we make it on its own. We start with an understanding of how the species might respond and what other people are doing. But the questions are always, is this the right tool for my question that I'm asking? So on this picture, you can see that's actually my hand for a change. They aren't always, because I tend to be the other side of the camera. That's a bird that I caught and tagged in Ireland as part of a study looking at how wintering curlew behave. So we don't only study breeding birds. When we think about curlew, and in fact pre-2015 when we thought about curlew in particular, this is often what we thought about. So there are more curlew in the UK in winter than in summer, because they're migratory and the UK doesn't freeze and we have really huge tides. So there's lots and lots of food available on our coastlines, and we get a lot of the, or a higher proportion of the global population of Eurasian curlew in the UK. And in fact, one of these birds is colour marked, which to a certain extent is a traditional way of investigating migration. This bird is identifiable as an individual when you point your binoculars at it. You can record those rings, communicate with the researcher that put them on, and get a history of the bird. But critically, what you get is a few dots on a map, and you will never get information for a bird that nobody saw. You will never get information about the route that the bird took in between those sightings. And our easy assumption is that it went in a straight line. But the more we find out about birds, the more we discover that they don't fly in straight lines. We've been trained by spectacular photography and filmography to think that you go out into the countryside and this is what you see. You get a beautiful view of a bird being a noble curlew in an interesting habitat, behaving normally, giving up all of its secrets to us. We can see the nest, we can see the chicks walking around, we can see how the birds respond to predators overhead, humans in the landscape, land use change. And we think that this is what we're going to see. But the reason that we need tracking studies actually is vividly displayed in the next slide, because researchers will tell you that this is mostly what you see. There is a curlew in that field. I promise you there's a curlew in that field. You might have to zoom in. But curlew are very hard to study. A lot of waders are hard to study, but curlew are particularly difficult because they're shy. They're also quite responsive to humans. So they will see you usually a kilometre away, and you won't see them unless they feel like showing you that they're present. And this creates a lot of error, particularly in monitoring data, because a group of curlew may actually mostly not respond to your presence. One bird or two birds will alarm, and the other 5 will stay on the ground saying, "Oh yes, okay, so there's somebody around, I'm going to sit tight." And in the next slide, you'll see an example of a particularly humbling experience that I think every curlew fieldworker has had. And this is an example of the curlew that sits tight and waits for you to almost tread on it before you see it, let alone before it decides to show itself to you. I've actually walked within 2 meters of a curlew nest, knowing that the bird was there somewhere, and been unable to see it until I was literally on top of it. I didn't tread on it, I should say. So curlew don't help us. And until we started tracking them, we based everything that we knew about how curlew use landscapes, and therefore how we should conserve curlew in those landscapes, on what we had seen. And of course, the curlew don't show us most of what they do. Now, there's an advanced version of this problem. And I've called it Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Some of you will recognize what that is. Heisenberg's uncertainty says that you can't know everything about, in this case, a subatomic particle, but don't worry about that too much. You might be able to measure its speed, but you won't know its location. And Curlew are spectacularly good at this, because if we were to try and observe them closely enough to fully understand how they use a landscape, they would not be behaving normally, because they would be responding to the presence of the observer. And a lot of what we need to know about them is what they do when we're not looking at them. We had, up until 2015, we didn't know anything about what Curlew did at night. We certainly didn't know anything about what Curlew did when there was no observer looking at them. And that's the core reason why we needed to use tracking data, because our partial understanding meant that we clearly weren't delivering conservation interventions that worked for the species, because you can see that the Curlew trend, in spite of everything that was being done in our landscapes, was continuing to decline. And we critically and urgently, even now, still need to understand more about what works for Curlew, where to intervene, and why they respond to different interventions and different landscape uses. We've heard already that humans intervene. That's what we do. We change landscapes, we change land uses, we create disturbance, but we all can also create positive change. And if we're going to turn around the declines in Curlew that are happening across the range of the species, that understanding what Curlew do when we aren't watching them is going to make the difference. We know that habitat change is having an impact. We know that predation pressure is having an impact. We know that the thing that's broken down in Curlew is not overwinter survival, which is excellent. It's not migration routes at the moment. The Curlew seem to be fine. What's happening is that they're not producing enough chicks. And unfortunately, the one stage in a Curlew's lifespan, which is almost impossible to observe properly, is productivity. Because Curlew don't tell us what their chicks are doing. They don't tell us how many chicks they have. And intervening at chick stage carries particularly high risks. So we're starting to use tag data to give us proxy information about some of these critical questions. Now, tag development has come a long way, even since 2015 when I started using them on Curlew. And the important thing to remember is that there are no two tags that do exactly the same job, and each tag type is designed for a specific job. So when a researcher has found a question that they can't answer with direct observation, the next question that they need to ask is, what information do I need? What type of tag is likely to deliver that for me? And how can I best attach it to my bird, which includes processes of catching and handling the species, of course, but how best can I attach it to give me not only great information, but also the minimal risk that I can bring to this bird's life, because they're already having quite a hard time. So we've established that we need to do some tagging, and our next consideration is, what do we need to know? Now, I could probably talk for about 6 hours on this subject, and I'm going to spare everybody that, but I am going to take two examples from what I see as the extreme ends of GPS tagging. There are different kinds of tag that produce different kinds of data, but for Curlew particularly, the two extremes that I would normally think of are, first of all, a short-term attachment. In this case, this tag is glued onto the bird's back using super glue. So you can see that it sits nicely, more or less between the shoulder blades. It sits at the balance point of the bird's body. It's glued to the skin, not the feathers, so the bird very rapidly forgets that it's there. And we've seen them, we've observed birds with glue mount tags, and they ignore them. They're much more interested in the colorings that you've put on. They can produce very high resolution data. The risk overall for the bird is relatively low, because the bird is going to drop that tag when it does its next body molt. So for a breeding bird, it will drop the tag at the end of the breeding season. If you tag in the winter, it will drop its tag at the end of the next breeding season. Sometimes they drop them before that. And there's a little bit of variation between researchers in their ability to make tags stick. The other thing about some of these tags is that because there's a trade-off between the amount of data that you get from them and the method that the tag uses to give you that data back, many of them have a certain amount of lag. What that means is that the tag will collect information at very high rates, but it will only give the information to you at intervals. So you're not going to get live data from this bird. You're not going to be able to see it moving around the landscape in real time, but you will get huge amounts of information on what it's doing. And the critical thing about data resolution is that it can tell you some particularly interesting things. In this slide, you can see thousands, and literally thousands of dots on the map from two different birds. One of them is presented as red dots and the other one is a sort of creamy colour. These are two female curlew that were tagged in the same place, in the same landscape. One of them bred successfully. The other of them did not breed successfully, and they were tagged in the same year. On the face of it, they actually look quite similar. At this scale, they look as if they're using landscapes in very similar ways. But we can look at the tag data in a lot more detail, and we can analyze it for behavior rather than for movements. And that can give us a lot of insights into what the birds are doing. But this is an example of what I was talking about earlier on. On this little plot here, you can see that there's a bunch of dots that are in black and a bunch of dots that are in grey. The dots in grey are what the bird was doing in daylight. We might have observed some of that, 2 or 3 dots a day rather than 100 dots a day, by direct observation. We could have been there with binoculars. Dots in black are what the bird was doing at night. It's in a different place. The distribution of the dots is different from the daytime dots. So if we based our decisions, our conservation decisions, on observation, we would miss half of what this bird does in that landscape. And that's common to curlew in all landscapes. And here we're looking at winter data. So that's the coastline of North Wales, in case anyone doesn't recognise it. And what we're doing here is modelling habitat use based on very high resolution data from about 30 of these glue-mounted tags that were applied in the winter. And the plot on the left shows you the distribution of observed curlew. So curlew are seen on estuaries at high tide in daytime, and you get this coastal distribution, and that's what we think of when we think of curlew wintering in Wales. The second map shows what curlew do at night. At night, curlew are going a long way inland, particularly at high tide. They're feeding on grasslands at night, and we never knew that they were prepared to go 10 or 12 or 15 kilometres inland to a field that they know, because they fly directly, until we put tags on the birds. At the other end of the tag data resolution spectrum, most of the time at the moment, we have long-term attachments, and often these are harnesses because those will stay on the bird through different molts. They generally produce less data, so you're not going to get 100 data points a day from these tags, mostly because they need to talk to satellites, because they give us more continuous data and often near live data. If you think about that invisible curlew in the landscape, if you were working in a landscape where the vegetation meant that you could never see a curlew on the ground, this sort of method will help you understand where your birds are and potentially allow you to do live protection. Explain to people what field the birds were in, what cutting or grassland management regime is less likely to have an impact on the breeding birds. And this is the sort of attachment that BTO are currently using for head-started birds from Norfolk. Because when we're asking questions of head-started birds, we want to know how quickly those birds start looking like wild curlew. We want to know where they're wintering to make sure that they're behaving in a way that's going to fit into the lifestyle of a curlew population. So we need tags that don't fall off at the end of a body molt, and we'll stay on the bird for 2 or 3 years and allow us to understand how the birds mature and whether they recruit into a breeding population. And in fact, this bird is a head-started bird called 9L. It was released in the August 2022 cohort. You can see that she wintered in Brittany, and in fact she stayed there until spring 2024 and then came back and has been learning to be a breeding curlew. She hasn't been successful yet because curlew mature quite slowly, but she's working on it, so she's attempting to breed back in Norfolk. I talked a little bit about insights into behaviour. So we've used some of the really high resolution data and explored birds with known breeding outcomes. So critically, there was a bird that was locally named Vincent, who was one of the first birds that we tagged with the high resolution tag. And he lost a breeding attempt because the field he was breeding in was mowed. But he taught us by understanding what had happened to him and looking for how his tracking data changed around that catastrophic event. He taught us to recognize the difference in behavior between incubation, chick guarding, chick loss, and non-breeding behavior in a breeding landscape, because curlew will very sneakily look like a breeding bird but not actually be trying, and about 25% of males in Wales don't breed in a given year. Once we can start to understand behaviour and identify whether birds are breeding and whether they're successful or not, we can also start building much more complex metrics about how the breeding season is going and what the probabilities are of birds being successful, producing or fledging chicks or failing in a landscape. And we can start to feed that back into understanding how to monitor these things on the ground without using tracking tags. But we can also use them to test and predict the outcomes of conservation interventions faster than we would get information if we just tried things, because we're running out of time for curlew. And ultimately, I'd just like to close by reminding everybody that when we're doing this kind of research, ultimately what we're doing is trying to understand how to protect curlew in the landscapes that we share with them. These were common farmland bird 40 years ago. Something has gone wrong, and understanding, high enough quality understanding, is the way that we can look for ways to make it better. Thank you.
Rachel, thank you. That was a great illustration of how individuals can provide insights into breeding behaviour, and you worked up to it really nicely so that you actually provided an excellent segue between the first talk and what comes next. So thank you very much indeed. One question for you. How applicable do you think your findings are to populations of curlew in other parts of Europe? So you were ahead of the game in terms of studying the curlew. Now that curlew are being studied all over the UK, for instance, are you recognizing the patterns you see, or is there a lot of difference between what's happening in Wales and what other populations of curlew are doing in terms of the breeding behavior?
At the moment, we're still testing our ability to understand behaviour from tag data, but the signs at the moment are excellent. The critical thing seems to be data resolution. So to get precise information on, for example, the timing of egg hatching, which is a really useful metric if you want to understand whether a nest would have hatched or not, whether it's been abandoned if it's been found with just eggs in it and no curlew around. So to understand that, you need a location about every 15 minutes. So you need relatively high resolution data. If you have that, the technique works for curlew wherever curlew are. So it's a way of getting that observation data without having to be there and disturbing the birds and looking at them as intensively as you would have to do if you didn't have tag data. And we're also beginning to test the ability to do the same sort of behavioural analysis in different breeding wader species. And so far it looks like it's helpful. I can't say that we know that it works yet, because this is relatively new technology and it's a very high data resolution that's required. So there aren't very many studies on other species that we can use to test it, but it seems to work in oystercatcher, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we might get a data set at the end of the summer for knot that would allow us to do the same test for knot behaviour.
Oh, that's fascinating. I'm going to steal a question from the Q&A, from the chat line. Mary Colworth says, do males and females use the landscape differently? It ties in so well with the previous question. I thought I would ask it at this point.
Yes, they do. That's the simple answer. The more complex answer is that they become more different as time goes on through the breeding season, because males do most of the chick guarding, and females will detach from a breeding attempt. If it's assuming it's successful, they detach when the chicks are about 5 days old. It varies a little bit, and they leave. So at that point, they look like non-breeding females because they've separated from the family group and the male is doing the chick guarding. But yes, and particularly more so in some landscapes. So in upland Wales, we find that during incubation, males will often spend nighttime quite a long way away from their breeding territory, 3 to 10 kilometers. And they will go to some other place that they know, usually that has water resource, and they'll hang about up there and come back just before dawn in the morning, which makes it enormously frustrating trying to catch them, actually, because you have to do it in daylight. Where females in upland Wales do the majority of the incubation and stay much closer to home, and they will tend to leave the nest and feed very intensively on often an improved grass field that's very close to the breeding area, and get back on the nest, and the males only do brief windows of incubation. But to a certain extent, it's different in different landscapes.
Thank you. I think that's a question for a bar sometime. I think probably you could talk about that for a very long time. I'm going to say thank you at that point, and move on to the third talk. So thank you, Rachel. So the third talk is by Verena Rupprecht. She's from the German organization LBV, which has been running a project on meadowbirds, including curlew and my favorite, the black-tailed godwit, for many years. In this evening's talk, she'll present new data on what she and her colleagues have learned from tagging Bavarian curlews. Many of the attendees tonight will be keen to increase the number of fledged youngsters. But what has happened to birds reared in Bavaria? What are the causes of mortality? What happens to juveniles in subsequent breeding seasons? Over to you.
Thank you, Graham, for the introduction. I will try just to introduce myself. I'm Verena Rupprecht, as you said, working for the LBV. The LBV is a nature conservation organization in Bavaria, which is in the south of Germany. We have almost 122,000 members and supporters, and almost 250 employees working for the LBV. So we are quite a big nature conservation organization in Bavaria, and we are partner of NABU, which you maybe know as a German NGO, which is not existing in Bavaria. So we are like the Bavarian NABU, you can say to some point. So, and today I will introduce you to our curlew tagging project, and I will start on the next slide with our Bavarian curlews to give you a short impression on that. So on the left side, the graph shows you the population in Bavaria of the curlews. As you see, in the last years, we are more or less stable on a low level. But the population decreased on high numbers, and the decrease started early before the 1980s. But that's when we have the first numbers of whole Bavaria that is shown in this graph. On the right map, you can see Bavaria, and the red dots showing the breeding pairs of the curlews. And so you see they are scattered all over the place, but mostly along river sides. So on the next slide, you will see our study areas of our telemetry project. We have different kind of projects for curlews in Bavaria. A lot of projects run running from different project leaders, but many of them from the LBV, which include habitat, monitoring, and all different kinds of stuff. But the GPS project was, one of our biggest research projects. The central research questions of our project was like, of course, as the GPS tags allow us to, that we analyze the migration threats, but we were specifically interested in the fate of the Bavarian juvenile birds, which we tagged, and what they were doing in subsequent breeding seasons, and identifying their mortality causes. And what was really important for us were the habitat requirements in the breeding areas, with a specific look on the study areas. And we tried to evaluate the measures there, the measurements for the curlews, and we tried to give recommendations for the conservation on site. We catched adult birds as well as juvenile birds. The juvenile birds were almost fledged, but not yet fully fledged, so we could catch them just by hand. The adult birds were catched on the nest with a bow net that you can see on the left side, or like a nest cage thing to catch them. And by that, we got a really good databases. So our databases are 42 curlews from 2016 to 2022 were tagged. So our project officially ended in December of last year. So we stopped tagging new birds 2 years before the project officially ended. We tagged 9 adult birds and 23 juvenile birds. And as you were seeing on the previous slide, we had 6 different study areas, but most birds were tagged in the study area Altmühltal. On the right picture, you see one of our birds. We had 2 different kinds of tags. We used tags from Ecotone, and we used tags from Ornitella. This bird wears an Ornitella tag with a solar panel on the back. And as you can see, all of our birds were ringed with colorings to allow for identification on site. In total, we collected over 800,000 GPS locations with these birds. And as an example, one of our birds called Franzi collected over 85,000 locations. As I said, we were especially interested in mortality reasons, and here you can see the fate of all of our birds. As you can see, still 4 of our tags are active and are still sending data to us. But what you can also see is that 14 of our transmitters were defective. So they were stopping to transmit data without obvious reasons. Some of them because they were quite old transmitters, but some of them also after quite a short time that they were attached to the bird. And what you can also see that 11 of our juvenile birds were predated still in the breeding area before their first migration. And but what you can also see if you look down to the bottom, that we had 2 cases of poached birds in Morocco. So to have a closer look now on our juvenile birds and the loss, 11 of our 33 tagged juvenile birds were predated in the breeding area. This was happening on average 10 days after tagging. So we could not see that it was mainly because of the tagging itself, because the birds were disorientated or something, but it was most of the time on average 10 days after tagging. 10 of these birds were not yet fully fledged. They were on average 41 days old when they were predated. I say fully fledged because we learned that we need to make a difference in our project from what you would call a fledged bird when you're in the field. So you would see a bird that is flying shorter distances, is using its wings and starts to fly. That's what you maybe would call a fledged bird. But we also saw that there is a bigger time and several days until the birds from the start of flying and trying to fly to be really capable of moving wider distances and to visit sites, for example, for the night where they would be safe from ground predators. So we made these differences from full to fully fledged. In 8 cases, we saw that it was clearly a ground predator that predated the bird. 1 case was likely a peregrine falcon. And as you can see on the graph, most birds were predated on nighttime, but also 4 of them during the day. So I had to decide to give you just some short impressions and some examples of our data. So I was thinking about what I will show you to our adult curlews. So I decided for this kind of graphs because I find it very interesting, and it's really cool that it really fits with what Rachel was saying now. Because for our Bavarian birds, for the females would always breed during the day, and the male birds would always breed during the night. And what you can see here in the graphs is the distance of the individual adult birds to their nest site during breeding and after breeding. And on the left side, you see the distance to the nest during breeding. And we see a big difference because the female birds would not breed in the night, but spend the night on specific nocturnal roost sites, sleeping places, which were quite distant to the nest location. As you can see on the right side, some birds almost moved 12 kilometers almost every night during they had eggs in their nest. But the males would always stay on the nest. After breeding, this changes, and the pattern you can see is more differently. On the lower part of the slide, you can see a detailed analysis of one specific individual. It's a male bird, and on the left side, you can see the distance to the nest during breeding, and you see there's one day that is different, but on average, it stays closer than 300 meters around the nest all day long, because it would breed during the night and it would also stay on around the nest during the day. For a female, this would be really different. It will move away in the night. After hatching, on the right side, you can see that this male had chicks for around 24 days. That's when it spent the most time around the former nest place. After 24 days, it lost its chicks and moved to another place. And 33 days after hatching, it started its migration to the wintering site. Here in this map, I will just show you an example of 2 adult birds in their breeding site. So on one hand, you can see a breeding site, a typical one in Bavaria. So it's on the lower part, you can see a river, and you see meadows, and you see also some arable fields. What you see are 2 different birds, one in purple and the other one in green. The bigger dots indicate the nests in subsequent years. And the black line that you can see around the points is an electrical fence we use to protect the breeding sites from ground predators. And you can see how site faithful these birds are during breeding. Here you see the tagged juvenile birds in our study area Altmühltal. Here we tagged 16 juveniles in total, but only 7 of them left the breeding site for migrations. The other were predated or got lost on the breeding site before migration. The different colors are indicating different individuals, and the black circle shows the area where most of the birds were tagged. So we see that when they get more mobile, they start to spread more to the south. So all of them, no matter which year, moved to the south, moved to this specific place that is there indicated by this orange arrow. This is a site on a lake with shallow water, which is used by adult curlews for the night. For example, by breeding females, they are always going there. which we know by tagging them. But as soon as the curlews, the juvenile curlews, were fully fledged, that's where I make the difference, they started to spend the night also on this shallow water surface inside the lake and were safe from predation there. Before they were, by my definition, fully fledged, they spent the night in the meadows right next to the place where they were feeding during the day. So we found that this is a really important thing for these birds there, that they have this night place. Something we saw on another study area was something similar, but it was artificially. What you can see here is the data of 2 juvenile birds, but just the points, just the locations from the night. So the points during the day are not shown in the map. On the left side, you can see the data when the birds were not yet fledged. On the right side, you see the data when the birds were fledged. And what you can see also is the black line that shows again an electrical fence to protect the birds from ground predators. And other than in the slide before, you can see that the birds spent the night always at the same place, no matter if they were fledged or not fledged, because the birds, they hatched inside the fence because the area where they were breeding was fenced. And inside this fence, there was a depression that was artificially irrigated by pumps. So you can see it on the photo. So this place was very attractive for the birds to spend their night there the whole season long, because it was always wet, no matter if it was a dry season or if there was no rain for a longer period of time. So these birds were safe during the night from ground predators, which we saw is a big plus for this population in this area, which is doing quite good compared to other breeding sites in Bavaria. And another one that I would want to show you just as an example, as I know that you also have breeding curlews on airfields in England. We have a big population of curlews inside the Munich airport, and I'm talking about inside the Munich airport fence, not the meadows around the airport, but right next to the runways. And we have there actually the biggest breeding population of curlews in Bavaria with 100 breeding pairs, and it's the only growing population in Bavaria, or growing in bigger numbers. And we also have a good population of 120 lapwings there. And we were able to tag 2 birds there, which was really interesting for us to see. So to show you now some of our migration data, you can see our birds are going to the southwest. They are not going to England, they are not going to the Netherlands, they are going to France, they are going to Morocco, Spain, Portugal. And here on the map, you can see the first spring migration in black of the adult birds and in purple of the juvenile birds or young curlews. And you can see during the first migrations, the young birds have really big trouble to find their way back to Bavaria, going in big circles. And in the second spring migration, when they were migrating the second time, they were doing much better and going a direct way back to Bavaria. So if we look at the other direction, from the breeding ground to the wintering ground, we saw that 14 out of 17 juveniles flew beyond the coastline during their first migration to the wintering areas. Some of them just 13 kilometers, but some of them up to 235 kilometers from the coastline. In the map, the arrows show you where this happened and that the birds were always flying out and then returning back to the coast when they saw that they did a mistake there. If we look at our migration routes, so the places where they do a stopover, on the left side, you see a map where all of the places where our Bavarian birds stopped for a longer period of time are shown, while the bigger points are indicating places where they stayed longer. And on the right side, you see migration of one single adult birds in subsequent years, and the black dots showing the stopover sites. And what I wanted to show you with these maps is that our curlews do not really have their fixed roost sites. They're not visiting the same places year by year, but it is very scattered all over the place and varying in subsequent years. Here you can see the wintering areas of our Bavarian birds, or the wintering areas we know thanks to GPS tagging. So as I said, ours are in the southwest of Europe and also in Morocco. The right map shows you the wintering area, the white area and the white lines in the map of a single individual in 2 subsequent winters. So it looks almost identical, but it is not. But I think it's really interesting to also see how site faithful they are also in the wintering sites. So, and there on the right bottom, you see one of our most famous birds. It was called Ludwig, and it's also the same that you can now see on the last slide. One time in the wintering area and one time in this breeding area. As this was just a short insight and I was not able to include all of our findings, for example, we also found that some of our young curlews showed really an excessive exploration behavior when they come back to the breeding grounds in their first years. And it was like some of them were just exploring an area from 30 to 50 kilometers around a breeding ground, but others went from Bavaria to Poland and to Czech and to Austria to have a look around. And I was also not able to show you our data that shows that young curlews often change their breeding grounds and that they do not have a fixed territory in their first years as the adult birds do. And for example, we were also looking at on the response of curlews to mowing in their breeding grounds. But for this, we have a publication already, which I can then share with you in the chat. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope it was okay with my English for you to understand.
Danke, Verena. Thank you. Your English is excellent, and that was a wonderful talk. I could listen to you and to the other speakers for a long time, and in fact, we have used nearly all the time up to 8 o'clock. So I'm going to have a quick look and see what we've got in the question and answer. But if you don't mind, I won't ask you a specific question now, although I've got enough questions to keep me going for many an hour. Just a second. Let me have a look at the. So there's a question from Prasad, which I've answered myself. The impact of the fence, Verena, there is a question from you about the impact of the fence at Munich Airport. Is that presumably keeping away ground predators? And in this country, we try to remove all birds from airports because they're seen as a hazard to aircraft. Why is it so different in Munich?
Yeah, when I learned that you do that in England, I really hoped that the Munich airport people would never hear that, so that they would still accept our curlews in these big numbers on their airfield. So no, the fence around the Munich airport, it helps against dogs and people walking around, but it is not holding a fox for climb. They would just climb over it, or they will find holes. But they have employees there at the airport that are called bird controller they are needed, for example, if there are goose or something on the airfields. And when there are no birds to control, they control the predators. So these are hunters and they're doing big predator control there, actually.
What amazing people. What a complete bonus. That's excellent.
Yes, it is.
Yes, thank you. And you say 100 pairs of curlew on that airport?
Yes. Yeah,
Wow.
like what I always have to add at this point is that these are the numbers of the airport, because I would not be allowed to go there and count them. But we have to trust in their numbers. And if you are around the airport, or if you ever feel like coming to Bavaria and you will fly to Munich, you will see the curlews. They are there. So if the numbers are in detail totally correct, I can't say, but I think so.
But even if it was 50 pairs or 30 pairs, it's still significant.
It's
Thank
more
you.
than 30, we know that
Yeah.
for sure, but
Yeah.
yes.
Yes, so it's the same question. It does raise the question of why we take eggs or heads starting from airfields. Yes, it's a really interesting question. I think you might get some emails from other people on that one, Verena. I think there's going to be some very interested people in this country, and I think the same goes for you, Katrine. I could see Jackie Clark and Nigel taking notes. Nigel is on the technical panel for ringing for strange things you do to birds. So you might get some emails as well. So thank you it's been really interesting to share with you what's been happening. I'm going to wind up because geese. We just had a question saying that the geese are big enough to cause a problem for a big Rolls-Royce engine, but a Godwit would be, sorry, Godwit, that's me thinking Godwits. A Curlew would just get shredded, I'm assuming, so not such a problem. So I think I'm going to just take it, stop at this point and just say that this has been excellent. It's been a really nice, the three of you, having never spoken to each other before tonight and not having seen each other's talks, have produced a program which has really worked together exceptionally well. So Katrine, Rachel, Verena, and I know I pronounced it wrong again, I'm sorry, Verena. The three of you have given us a really great evening. To everybody else, thank you for attending. Thank you to those who asked questions, which I hope we've tried to answer as we've gone through. Thank you to Megan for putting links to things so that we can follow up other things. If you want to support Curlew Action, then the best way to do it is to slip them a few quid. So don't forget to do that bit as well. But also a reminder that this was recorded, so you'll be able to go back and listen again. And I particularly will be going back to, well, in fact, all of them for very different reasons. I thought they were excellent talks. So thank you very much. And thank you to Curlew Action for giving us such an excellent evening. Thank you.